Reminder to all, please keep your microphone muted unless speaking. And should I hear any inadvertent background noise, I'll request the member please mute their microphone. To insert a document into the record as well, please have your staff email it to documentsti@mail.house.gov. So now I recognize myself for an opening statement. So good morning and welcome to today's Aviation Subcommittee hearing titled Accessible Air Travel, Addressing Challenges for Passengers with Disabilities. In my home state of Washington and across the country, the aviation sector is recovering from the COVID-19 pandemic. The number of flights and passengers is approaching pre-pandemic levels. This past Tuesday, the Transportation Security Administration recorded nearly 1.9 million passengers screened across the country. That number is 99% of the total for the same date in 2019 and over 300% of the total for the same date in 2020. However, one group that continues to face challenges in air travel is the group people with disabilities. So to improve equity for all air travelers, Congress must understand the challenges these passengers face from the curb to the gate and back again to ensure the rights and safety of all airline passengers. I first will like to welcome my friend, Representative Jim Langevin of the great state of Rhode Island. I've had the privilege of serving with Representative Langevin on the Armed Services Committee for the last 22 years. I know how committed he is to improving the lives of Americans with disabilities, and he is retiring at the end of the year. And so I want to stop briefly and thank Jim for his long service to the U.S. Congress, the nation, and your constituents in Rhode Island. The Air Carrier Access Act became law in 1986 and prohibits discrimination against passengers with disabilities in air travel. Following the law's enactment, the U.S. Department of Transportation issued regulations that required airlines to require aircraft accessibility features, boarding and deplaning assistance, seating accommodation, and other aids. And Congress should discuss how to modernize the law's language to meet current challenges facing passengers with disabilities. And we all look forward to hearing from Representative Langevin about ideas to do just that. And thanks to this committee, the FAA Reauthorization Act of 2018 included several provisions to improve air travel accessibility for passengers with disabilities. It drafted an Airline Passengers with Disabilities Bill of Rights, which was released in July. Issued a final rule to clarify the definition of a service animal, began reporting data on mishandled wheelchairs, and established an advisory committee on the air travel needs of passengers with disabilities. Additionally, the 2018 law directed the GAO to examine best practices in airport accessibility and airlines training initiatives related to assisting passengers with disabilities. And although the 2018 law made good policy changes, it is still critical for Congress to hear from people who are most impacted by these policies to examine what is working and what can be improved in future legislation. In November 19, I chaired a subcommittee roundtable to better understand these challenges that the passengers with disabilities face, including aircraft boarding and deplaning process, inaccessible onboard lavatories, inappropriate screening techniques, and damaged wheelchairs and mobility aids. And subsequently, in a report in April 2021, GAO found that passengers with disabilities continue to face infrastructure, information, and customer service barriers at U.S. airports. So we'll be interested to hear from Heather Kraus from the GAO on any updates to that report and other items for the 2018 law that have yet to be operationalized. We all look forward as well to hearing from Brian Ricks with the Metropolitan Airports Commission in Minnesota, Minneapolis-St. Paul area about the airport's efforts to break down barriers for passengers with disabilities. Improving equity through the aviation system means improving airport accessibility. And as I mentioned, passengers with disabilities face challenges at U.S. airports regarding how terminals are designed and constructed. So to help these issues, Congress passed and President Biden signed the bipartisan infrastructure law a little over a year ago. And thanks to the BIL, the Department of Transportation will invest $5 billion over the next 5 years to modernize our nation's airport terminals by, among other things, helping to provide greater accessibility for individuals with disabilities. This summer, the DOT awarded the first $1 billion in funding for these projects, with 73 grants specifically designed for projects to improve accessibility, including one at SeaTac in Washington State, where they were awarded $10 million for terminal updates that will make restrooms more accessible. Here in the DC area, Dulles International was awarded a nearly $50 million to construct a new 14-gate concourse, which will be able to better serve all passengers, including passengers with disabilities. Dexter Regional in Maine and other general aviation airports like Rosecrans Memorial Airport in Missouri are also receiving federal funding to improve accessibility. So I look forward to hearing from our panelists from the aviation sector and the disability community advocates on what issues are most pressing and what solutions should be considered. So as we look forward to the 2023 FAA reauthorization bill, this subcommittee must find ways to enhance the air travel experience for people with disabilities. And this includes all people with disabilities, including people in wheelchairs, as well as those who may be deaf, blind, or have other types of mental or physical disabilities. Today's witnesses will provide much needed insight into the issues facing this particular community, how U.S. airports and airlines are working to find solutions, how Congress can be a better partner in these efforts to ensure the future of U.S. air travel remains bright for all passengers. Thank you, and I look forward to working with everyone collaboratively. I will now turn to the ranking member, Mr. Graves of Louisiana, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses. I appreciate y'all being here. I want to give a special thank you to Representative Langevin, for your testimony today, for being here and for sharing your personal experiences with travel to help improve legislation to ensure that the experience is improved for all passengers. It's no secret that we fly a lot. Even before the pandemic, flying in this country had a number of challenges. And you often hear people that isolate certain parts of the travel experience. Maybe it's something bad that happened with TSA, maybe it was their luggage, maybe it was a bad experience parking or something along those lines. I think what's most important is that we look at this entire experience cumulatively. I think you have to think about the packing that the families have to do, the getting to the airport, the parking at the lots, the shuttle to the airport, the checking in, potentially paying for baggage, going through security, paying $10 for water and $12 for a granola bar at the airport. If you're late, maybe you get to pay a change of ticket fee. You have to line up, in many cases, like cattle calls, getting in, sitting in seats that in some cases cause challenges. Look, this whole experience has to be looked at cumulatively. Then you land at the other airport and you go through it all over again. We can't look at just one single piece of it. We've got to look at the cumulative experience and ensure that every party, whether again, it's the parking lot vendors, it's the shuttles, it's the airport security, the airports, or other components of the experience, are all working together in a complementary manner and help to decompress that experience, especially for those with additional challenges. At the end of the day, you've paid hundreds of dollars or maybe even thousands by the time you add in the tax dollars going to the airports and other entities involved and for the privilege of this experience that in many cases, as we all know, has negative consequences. Keep in mind, that's the baseline experience for most passengers. Now imagine if you're disabled or differently abled passenger. Individuals with disabilities already face unique challenges in everyday life, and it's especially true during air travel. It's no wonder many disabled passengers choose not to travel by air and in turn miss out on important family functions or work opportunities. We're here to discuss those overwhelming challenges, everything from the check-in kiosk and baggage claim at the destination. Just last month was the 36th anniversary of the passage of the Air Carrier Access Act, an important piece of legislation that prohibits the discrimination of persons with disabilities during air travel. While great advancement has been made in addressing barriers to access for those in the disability community, as we're going to learn today, many barriers still exist. In August of this year, there were 195 disability-related complaints reported during air travel, 195. Furthermore, there were over 1,000 reports of mishandled wheelchairs or scooters. As air travel continues to grow and be a necessary mode of transportation, it's important that we address these issues. The 2018 FAA Reauthorization Act included a bipartisan subtitle addressing issues related to aviation consumers with disabilities. As the chairman noted, we covered a number of improvements, including the GAO report that was issued last year recommending some additional actions. This included establishment of the Air Carrier Access Act Advisory Committee tasked with investigating different aspects of travel experience and providing recommendations to address air travel needs. It required a review of practices for ticketing, pre-flight assignments, and stowing of assisted devices to ensure that individuals with disabilities receive necessary accommodations. Furthermore, it called for a disabled passenger bill of rights, among other provisions. It's important to understand what has been accomplished and what work remains to be done as we look forward to the future and decide how we can improve. Collaboration from the aviation industry and relevant stakeholders, as I noted at the beginning, it's absolutely key to this comprehensive experience that air travelers go through whenever they're getting on planes or going to the airports or leaving airports. And I think it's key to our shared goal of addressing issues that passengers with disabilities face. We should continue to work together on provisions in the 2018 FAA reauthorization and ensure that passengers with disabilities have a dignified experience. Again, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing. Yield back.
Thank you, Representative Graves. Now turn to the chair of the full committee, Mr. Fazio of the great state of Oregon.
Well, thanks, Chair Larson, for calling this important hearing on improving the air travel experience for passengers with disability. A lot of people don't know that actually my background before I got into politics and all that was I was a rehabilitation counselor. So I'm quite familiar with some of the struggles, and part of our training was we had to spend a week in a wheelchair. In those days, we didn't have curb cuts. It was even worse than it is now. You know, you really begin to appreciate the struggles of people with disabilities. And, you know, it's important to have the stakeholders here today to talk about how we can improve this experience. I mean, the industry is recovering wonderfully. This committee acted to save the airline industry. But despite it, that recovery and a lot of profitability, we aren't seeing a big improvement in the experience for passengers with disabilities, and it's past time that happened. You know, just a few examples. Last month, a passenger was stranded at Orlando Airport for 5 hours after an airline lost their $22,000 wheelchair. This summer, an airline destroyed another passenger's wheelchair, then significantly damaged his replacement chair 3 weeks later. Earlier this year, a passenger was delayed getting her wheelchair at Newark, only to discover it had been left on the tarmac for nearly an hour. The list goes on and on. It's not excusable for this to be happening. These are special items, sometimes irreplaceable or nearly irreplaceable items, and certainly in the short term. You know, this has got to change. They say, well, you know, that things are better. They only mishandled 1.56%. Well, that's 1,057 wheelchairs and scooters in 1 month have been mishandled, damaged, gone missing, whatever. That is not an acceptable statistic. And I can only imagine what things would be like if we hadn't, as referenced by the ranking member, in a bipartisan way, if we hadn't included measures in the FAA reauthorization in 2018, you know, creating the Air Carrier Access Advisory Committee, you know, and DOT is still now working on rules to address safety issues relating to assistance with wheelchairs, mobility aids, clarifying airlines' responsibility to provide prompt assistance upon request to passengers with disabilities navigate within the airport, including examining whether to require hands-on training for airline employees or their contractors who are responsible for helping folks in the airport. We had, as again referenced by the ranking member, GAO report about problems, accessible laboratories and others. And we have the first ever airline passengers with disabilities Bill of Rights, which outlines basic protections for passengers with disabilities and responsibilities of the aviation industry under the Air Carrier Access Act. So we've made some progress, but as I mentioned above, there's a lot more to do. I think we could be able to get to the point where they don't lose or damage any assistance devices. I don't think that's too much to ask. You know, there are other issues to be resolved. It's been 3 decades. I was here, I've been here 36 years, and I was in my second term, when Americans with Disabilities Act was passed, signed by G.H.W. Bush, and significantly amended in '08 and signed by G.W. Bush. This has always been a bipartisan issue, and we should be able to make more progress. We want to give all air passengers a dignified experience, and that includes, obviously, people with disabilities. So I want to thank my colleague and friend, Jim Langevin, for his service, his incredible advocacy on this issue to help move the ball, help to make things better for other passengers with disabilities. I congratulate him on, a job well done, served his district well. He's going to retire, as am I, but we're not going to go away on this issue. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Appreciate that. We now want to welcome our witness on panel 1, Representative James R. Langevin, representing Rhode Island's 2nd District. Thanks for joining us today. We look forward to your testimony. As a note to members, as usual, as a member, Mr. Langevin will have 5 minutes, maybe a little bit more if you're nice to us, Jim. And won't be subject to questions, but I'm sure he'll be available on the House floor to answer any questions you have. And then we'll proceed directly to the second panel after his testimony. So without objection, our witness's full statement will be included in the record. Since it's part of the record, the subcommittee requests that you just finish it when you can, your oral testimony when you can. So Representative Langevin, you may proceed.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, Chairman Larson, Ranking Member Graves, and Chairman of the full committee, Chairman DeFazio, and distinguished members of the Aviation Subcommittee. I want to thank you for your attention to this important topic and for inviting me to testify before you today. As a point of personal privilege, if I could just take a moment just to congratulate Chairman DeFazio. Like me, he'll be retiring at the end of this year. Mr. Chairman, I thank you for your leadership of this committee, but in particular your support and attention to people with disabilities, especially given your background in your previous life. I wish you well in the next chapter. I'd also like to thank the other witnesses for being here today and for their ongoing work in support of air travel accessibility. This issue is deeply personal for me, as you can imagine. I've been a wheelchair user ever since 1980 when an accidental gunshot left me paralyzed. In addition, I'm the first quadriplegic ever to serve in the United States Congress. As you're all well aware, of course, serving in Congress requires a significant amount of air travel. At a minimum, we're expected to travel back and forth between our districts in Washington, D.C. whenever the House is in session. My hometown of Warwick, Rhode Island, is approximately 350 miles away from the U.S. Capitol. By train or car, that trip generally takes 6 or 7 hours respectively in each direction. By airplane, it takes approximately 1 hour to hour and a half at most. As you can see, for me, accessible air travel is a must because without it, I would not be able to do my job effectively. Throughout my career, I estimate that I've flown more than 1,000 commercial flights, both domestically and internationally, and the vast majority of which have been without issue. However, flying as a wheelchair user, even when everything goes as planned, is a complex process that typically involves reserving accommodations in advance, making multiple surface transfers while boarding and deplaning, as well as having my chair brought from the gate of the opening of the door of the plane up a jetway on an elevator, then into the belly of the plane, and then the reverse process when I land. And of course, on the plane, restricted mobility while on board the aircraft. The best case scenario is an exhausting trip. However, when something goes wrong, the consequences can range from inconvenient to catastrophic. Since 1986, the Air Carrier Access Act has served to protect the rights and safety of air travelers with disabilities. Despite the protections afforded by this law, people with disabilities continue to encounter significant barriers when they fly. So this includes damaged assistive devices and wheelchairs, denied boarding, delayed assistance, poor communication, and lack of accessible seating accommodations, all things that I have personally experienced. In the past year alone, I've been wrongfully denied boarding on multiple occasions because my wheelchair's lithium-ion batteries, despite presenting documentation that they met all applicable safety standards as determined by the Federal Aviation Administration. Lithium-ion batteries are becoming increasingly prevalent in assistive devices, which means that these incidents will only occur more often. That's why I'm working to introduce a bill that I call the Wheels Chairs on Airplanes Act to ensure that airlines' policies for lithium-ion batteries in wheelchairs and other assistive devices are no more restrictive than applicable FAA safety standards. On another occasion, several years ago, I remember watching through the airplane window as a baggage handler was sending my wheelchair up to the jet bridge on the belt loader. They placed it on the belt loader without holding it or locking it in place, and I watched as it rolled off the belt loader as the belt loader was raised to the jetway as it crashed down to the ground. Well, I have to tell you, I still get an uneasy feeling every time my wheelchair is brought out of the cargo hold. After all, if it's damaged, I'm stranded. My wheelchair is essentially my legs. As you will hear from other witnesses today, my experiences are not unique. In fact, in 2018 alone, passengers in the United States filed more than 36,000 disability-related complaints with airlines. I think we can all agree that the status quo is unacceptable. So that's why I've been working to improve air travel accessibility throughout my time in Congress. For example, I introduced language during the 115th Congress to create an airline passengers with Disabilities Bill of Rights. With the support of this committee, that language became law as part of the FAA Reauthorization Act of 2018, and I thank you. This Congress, I introduced H.R. 1696, the Air Carrier Access Amendments Act, with Representative Titus and Cohen, both of whom serve in the subcommittee, and I thank them for their partnership. In closing, H.R. 1696 proposes a two-pronged solution. Namely, it would improve air travel accessibility while holding airlines accountable when they violate passengers' rights. Overall, we must work to break down all barriers in our society so that people with disabilities can live more full and independent lives. Air travel must be a part of that effort. With that, I'd like to thank you once again for your attention to this important issue, as well as the opportunity to testify. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your leadership and your support. Thank you.
Jimmy, we're going to miss you here in Capitol Hill, and Rhode Island will be better for it, for you being back home. But we don't want you to be a stranger, as well.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate your words.
And thanks for setting up the rest of the panel discussion for us, the rest of the hearing discussion for us with your testimony. We'll take a few minutes for representative to move and clear some space, and we'll ask the second panel to come up. We're getting the panel set up with name tags and all that. There we go. Folks want to take their seats. Just one more moment here. I think, if the staff needs to do something to address things before we get started again, just go for it. Okay, I think we have everybody in the order that we want them to be in at the table. Exactly. So we'll get started on our second panel. I want to welcome the second panel. I'll just introduce them in order before we move to their statements. We have Heather Ansley, who's the Associate Executive Director of Government Relations with the PVA, Paralyzed Veterans of America. Brian Ricks, the Executive Director and CEO of Metropolitan Airports Commission on behalf of the Airports Council International North America. Matt Scott, who's joining us online, a three-time Paralympic medalist with Team USA. Heather Kraus, the Director of Physical Infrastructure at the Government Accountability Office. And also joining online, Graham Keithley, Vice President and Associate General Counsel of Airlines for America, A4A. Thanks all for joining us today. We all look forward to your testimony. Without objection, our witnesses' full statements will be included in the record. And since that is the case, the subcommittee does request that you limit your oral testimony to 5 minutes. If you were members of Congress, we'd give you more time, but 5 minutes. So with that, Ms. Ansley, you may proceed.
Thank you, Chairman Larson, Ranking Member Graves, and members of the subcommittee. Paralyzed Veterans of America thanks you for the opportunity to testify about the problems passengers with disabilities encounter in air travel. The Air Carrier Access Act, or the ACAA, was signed nearly 40 years ago and prohibits disability-based discrimination in air travel. Unfortunately, the air travel experience of passengers with disabilities, particularly for wheelchair users, is at best frustrating and at worst unsafe. In a survey completed last December, one passenger said, quote, "I am tired of getting dropped when transferring from my chair to the transfer chair on an airplane." Another said, quote, "The risk of damage to my wheelchair is too great. My wheelchair is my legs, and if I arrive at my destination and find it damaged, there are serious consequences to me." When a wheelchair is lost, damaged, or delayed, it is a significant and serious problem for the individual who relies on it. A broken chair can mean the end of the trip or even weeks or months of using a loaned wheelchair. Not having access to a proper wheelchair can lead to further injury or even death. In 2021, air carriers emplaned over 500,000 wheelchairs and scooters and mishandled over 7,000. Although the rate of mishandled devices may seem low, those affected are completely disenfranchised from their daily lives until their device has been repaired, located, or replaced. In the next FAA reauthorization, we would like to see requirements for the Department of Transportation to provide greater analysis and aggregation of the data, including separating incidences related to manual wheelchairs, power wheelchairs, and scooters, to look for trends as well as develop solutions to address areas of specific concern, focus on attacking the root cause of mishandled assistive devices. The industry's recovery following the COVID pandemic has only escalated our concerns. Since just this spring, we have heard reports from our members about insufficient numbers of people being sent to physically lift them during the boarding and deplaning process, misplaced wheelchairs that resulted in injury and humiliation due to lack of bathroom access, broken wheelchairs, delayed repairs to those chairs, and even a threat to contact law enforcement if a PVA member refused to deplane before his wheelchair was available to him. Sadly, these are not isolated incidents. Indignant treatment is normal. Passengers with disabilities often find they have limited recourse in these situations. They may share their frustration on social media and file a complaint with a specific airline and/or the Department of Transportation, and the department can issue cease and desist orders and levy civil penalties for violations. However, the largest financial penalty in recent years was in 2016 for $2 million. The major problem with commercial air travel is that aircraft are required to have very few accessible features. Wheelchair users in commercial air travel must have their highly customized, expensive devices stowed for the flight. This leaves baggage handlers to figure out how to fit these devices into cargo holds that are not designed to receive or stow them. It also leaves the passengers who depend on them stressed and worried that their device will not be returned to them either in a usable condition or perhaps even at all. PVA urges Congress to make systemic improvements in air travel in the next FAA reauthorization by including the Air Carrier Access Amendments Act, which was introduced by Representative Langevin. This legislation would ensure new airplanes meet design standards that accommodate the needs of people with disabilities. Additionally, it would require removal of access barriers on existing airplanes, only if it can be done without much difficulty or expense. The legislation would also strengthen enforcement by requiring referral of certain passenger file complaints to the Attorney General and establishing a private right of action. Passengers will continue to be injured and wheelchairs mishandled until travelers can stay safely seated in their devices. Thus, we call on Congress to include language in the next reauthorization directing appropriate agencies and administrations to take the steps outlined in a September 2021 report on in-cabin wheelchair restraint systems. If the remaining issues are properly addressed, Congress should require the department to promulgate regulations implementing requirements for in-cabin wheelchair securement. Until then, the air carriers must improve training and provide job aid materials for wheelchair attendants who lift passengers and baggage handlers who are responsible for loading wheelchairs on and off of aircraft. DOT must also increase its enforcement. We believe that improved training, increased aircraft accessibility, and stronger enforcement will lead to safer travel experiences for passengers with disabilities, both now and in the future. PVA hopes that we can all agree that disabled passengers, including disabled veterans, have waited long enough. Thank you for this opportunity to express our views. I would be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much for the testimony. I now turn to Mr. Brian Ricks of the Metropolitan Airports Commission. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Chairman Larson. Good morning, Chairman DeFazio and Ranking Member Graves. Thank you for inviting me here this morning to talk a little bit about the important issue of the commercial airport perspective relative to improving accessibility in air travel. In addition to serving as the Executive Director and CEO of the Metropolitan Airports Commission, which owns and operates Minneapolis-St. Paul International Airport and 6 general aviation airports, I am also chair of the Airports Council International North America Large Hub Committee and serve on ACI's U.S. Policy Council. The airport industry recognizes that travel hurdles can have a magnified impact when experienced by passengers with disabilities, and we are committed to fostering an inclusive air travel experience. In addition to our federal, state, and local compliance requirements, airports work broadly with disability advocates and our government, airline, tenant, and local community stakeholders to develop aspirational accessibility goals before designing and implementing innovative solutions. MSP has been at the forefront of creating an accessible passenger experience through investing in relationships, technology, training, and infrastructure. Our accessibility journey has been informed and guided by the expertise of our Travelers with Disabilities Advisory Committee. TDAC, as we call it, was established in 2014, and it consists of disability advocates from our community, as well as airport staff and representatives from airlines, airline contractors, the TSA, and CBP. Our TDAC chairperson represents the Minnesota Commission for the Deaf, Blind, and Hard of Hearing. The committee is results-oriented, providing constructive feedback on how we address accessibility through the implementation of programs and design of facilities that remove barriers for those with disabilities. It is a key voice in our long-term planning at MSP. Another area that we've been proactive in is the development of pre-flight training programs for individuals with sensory, physical, or cognitive disabilities. Our program, known as Navigating MSP, is a partnership between MSP, Delta Airlines, Autism Minnesota, and other local organizations. The goal is for individuals and families to gain experience traveling through the airport by rehearsing their journeys before they take them. This year, MSP, in partnership with Delta Airlines, unveiled a permanent mock aircraft cabin training facility to augment the program and accommodate employee training related to accessible travel. Airports have also made significant infrastructure and technology investments to improve the travel journey of those with disabilities. At MSP, we've invested $120 million over the past 10 years to construct state-of-the-art, award-winning accessible restrooms, as well as service animal relief areas in each concourse. Over the past 2 years, we've incorporated restrooms with adult changing tables and will continue these additions through our terminal and concourse redevelopment efforts. Finally, we were among the first airports to partner in technologies such as Hearing Loop, IRA, and Sunflower Lanyard to assist passengers with communications and their navigation through our facilities. Airports are extremely grateful to Congress for passing the bipartisan infrastructure law this year, which provided airports $20 billion over 5 years to make much-needed improvements. Included in this funding is the Airport Terminal Program, or ATP, which allocates $1 billion to airports annually over 5 years for terminal projects. Of the $1 billion granted for fiscal year 2022, roughly 2/3, or $600 million, went towards enhancements to accessibility and ADA compliance. For fiscal years 22 and 23, there have been nearly $25 billion worth of ATP projects submitted. Yet, as I just noted, only $1 billion is available each year. While the recent investment in the Airport Terminal Program is a welcome investment, the funding gap for terminal projects highlights the needs for additional federal assistance to keep pace with travel demands, including those travelers who require improved accessibility. According to the most recent Infrastructure Needs Survey by ACI&A, U.S. airports have $115 billion in infrastructure needs through the year 2023. And as I indicated earlier, airports are committed to enhancing airport accessibility, and next year's FAA reauthorization bill will be an excellent opportunity to help narrow the infrastructure funding gap to achieve the goal of accessible airports for all. Thank you for having me here today, and I look forward to any questions that you may have.
Thank you for your testimony. I'll now turn to Matt Scott, 3-time Paralympic medalist for Team USA wheelchair basketball team. Thank you very much for joining us. So Mr. Scott, we'll turn to you and recognize you for 5 minutes.
Thank you for having me. To the committee, thank you very much. My name is Matt Scott, and I've had the honor of representing Team USA for the United States for the Paralympics for Team USA's wheelchair basketball team throughout the last 5 consecutive games. Excuse me. Throughout this nearly 2 decades of commitment, I've been proud to compete at the highest level, and I've played an enormous role in raising societal perceptions of what it means to be a Paralympic athlete. The equity in adaptive sports has seen significantly positive change, largely due to the public awareness our athletes have generated. This awareness has shifted the minds in our society, and elite level Paralympians are being acknowledged for their accomplishments and respected for the hard work and commitment it takes. Unlike our able-bodied counterparts, in order to play wheelchair basketball, in order to compete at the highest level, we have to have specialized custom equipment created specifically for the purpose of sport. Our sports wheelchairs are entirely different from my daily wheelchair that you see me in now. The wheelchair that I use on a daily basis is vital to my mobility needs. It is my primary means of movement. My wheelchair makes me feel strong. My wheelchair makes me feel independent. My wheelchair makes me feel whole. While traveling for competition on numerous occasions, I have reached my destination and received my wheelchair mishandled, neglected, damaged, and sometimes destroyed beyond repair. The reality for the airline in these instances is that a piece of equipment is broken, and they are to take accountability by replacing it. My reality in these instances differs greatly. I consider my wheelchair to be an extension of my body. These items cannot simply just be replaced. I'm an active member in society. I work a full-time corporate job, serve on a board of directors, volunteer time with nonprofits, and have several deals that I need to manage sponsorship appearances for, and conduct a variety of public speaking roles throughout the country. Many of these commitments require me not to only have access to one of my wheelchairs, but access to both when I fly. When these items are returned to me after being mishandled, improperly handled by untrained personnel, when these are being mishandled improperly by untrained personnel, the damage that is done is devastating. Traveling internationally to world competition and arriving and realizing only that I will not be able to represent the country due to negligence is my worst nightmare, and a constant fear that many athletes like myself have had to experience. My fear is that the chair itself will be replaced in time. However, the loss of accolades, loss of income, loss of future opportunity, that goes unseen and unaccounted for. Not to mention the mental and emotional anguish that these experiences cause. I currently travel with arguably an unhealthy amount of anxiety during airline travel that stems from the uncertainty of whether I'll get my wheelchair in a suitable condition. My goal is that by providing this testimony, that these experiences are palpable. A solution that benefits all parties involved is possible when one thing is clearly and universally understood. Assisted mobility devices are not to be treated as just another piece of equipment, but handled with the appropriate care of trained personnel. My hope is to be part of this solution. This is not a complaint by any means, but a call to action, and I thank you for the opportunity to be heard.
Thank you, Mr. Scott, for your testimony, and we'll be back to you with some questions after we hear from 2 more witnesses. We'll now hear from Heather Kraus, Director of Physical Infrastructure at the Government Accountability Office. And as I noted before the hearing, good to see you actually in person, finally.
Thank you. Chair Larson, Ranking Member Graves, Chair DeFazio, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to discuss GAO's work on accessibility in air travel. Having accessible air travel is critical given that 1 in 4 adults in the US have a mobility, cognitive, hearing, vision, or other disability. Without effective accommodations, such as appropriate assistance and communication, air travel by passengers with disabilities can be extremely challenging. Recent data show almost 1,400 disability-related complaints to DOT in 2021, which is up 54% from the complaints received in 2019. Various federal requirements, including the Air Carrier Access Act, are designed to help ensure that air travel is accessible and available to people with disabilities on a non-discriminatory basis. More recently, the FAA Reauthorization Act of 2018 directed DOT to implement various provisions to improve accessible air travel. My testimony today is based on past and recent work examining aviation accessibility issues and focuses on 1, barriers to accessible air travel, 2, steps airports and airlines have taken to reduce those barriers, and 3, DOT's actions to respond to accessibility-related provisions and enforce accessibility-related regulations. First, our past work has highlighted a range of barriers that passengers with disability face in navigating through airports. For example, infrastructure-related barriers such as large, complex airports can require more cognitive and physical effort to navigate. Essential travel information such as flight status and emergency response instructions is not always available in a format for all. In addition, TSA screening practices may more frequently subject passengers with disabilities to additional screening. We also identified barriers that airlines are responsible for addressing. These include difficulties obtaining wheelchair and customer assistance, accessing onboard lavatories, and stowing wheelchairs or other assistive devices without damage. We reported that some airports and airlines have sought to reduce these barriers. For example, airports have installed new or improved ramps, elevators, and restrooms to comply with the Americans with Disabilities Act. Some airports have also implemented technology and other solutions that go beyond ADA requirements, including wayfinding and other individualized navigation assistance. In addition, airlines have been involved in a number of industry-led working groups, including efforts to develop new training to improve service for passengers with disabilities. While airport and airline efforts can help some passengers more easily or independently move through U.S. airports, these efforts vary among and even within airports. As noted by disability advocacy groups, airlines, airports, and others we have interviewed, no airport has addressed all barriers. Turning to DOT, we found that the agency has taken steps to implement 10 accessibility-related provisions in the 2018 Act. For example, DOT now requires the largest U.S. airlines to report the number of wheelchairs and scooters that were transported and damaged. DOT has also initiated rulemaking processes to address several other provisions in the Act, including improving wheelchair assistance and providing prompt assistance to passengers with disabilities. DOT has also taken steps to address other longstanding issues important to passengers with disabilities, including issuing a notice of proposed rulemaking to address accessible lavatories for single-aisle aircraft. Regarding disability-related enforcement actions, DOT has taken one since 2019, although the number of disability-related complaints to airlines and DOT has increased in recent years and is on track to exceed 2021 levels. We recommended in October 2020 that DOT increase transparency over its enforcement-related activities. The agency has not yet done so, but said it intends to provide more transparency and clarity into the results of its broader enforcement activities by year's end. Implementing our recommendations is critical to helping the public understand whether and how DOT's broader enforcement activities are addressing the increasing number of disability-related complaints. In closing, as the U.S. population ages, passengers with disability will be a growing customer segment of air travelers. While no one solution can address all barriers, the federal government, airlines, and airports, in coordination with the disability community, must continue to increase accessibility and ensure safe and dignified air travel for all. This concludes my statement. I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you. And finally, we'll turn to Graham Keithley, the Vice President and Associate General Counsel, Airlines for America, who is joining us online. Mr. Keithley, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Good morning. A4A appreciates the opportunity to testify today, and I'm personally honored to be presenting alongside our disability community and airport partners on this important topic. Thank you, Chairman Larson and Ranking Member Graves, for the invitation to participate today. In my role, I'm the A4A liaison to our members' Passenger Accessibility Committee, which includes our members' Passenger Accessibility Advocate Leads. The mission of that committee includes developing industry accessibility standards and sharing best practices to improve the air travel experience of passengers with disabilities. A4A thanks this committee for holding this hearing and to your commitment to oversight of passengers with accessibility issues. This hearing reflects the important and growing attention by all stakeholders to improve air travel accessibility for persons with disabilities. Our members are committed to accessibility, and they are working diligently with disability community partners, the Department of Transportation, the Federal Aviation Administration, and other stakeholders to improve air travel accessibility. A4A members take these issues very seriously and are committed to the dignity and respect of all passengers. All stakeholders recognize that more work needs to be done. U.S. airlines are the first to acknowledge that even one incident that jeopardizes the safety of passengers with disabilities is unacceptable. A4A members are fully committed to improving air travel accessibility for passengers with disabilities and have taken on several initiatives to better the travel experience in both the short and long term. Most recently, our members jointly announced a renewed commitment to improve accessibility. This commitment was established after hearing from the disability community about their accessibility concerns. Each of our members will have a passenger accessibility advisory group that includes the disability community to more acutely help airlines incorporate accessibility into their policies and operations. Mobility aid handling. That complex process explained earlier by Congressman Langevin is also a focus area of improvement, including the transfer of passengers between their mobility aids and seats. As I mentioned earlier, our members believe that any incident that jeopardizes safety is unacceptable, and they care and appreciate that their passengers with mobility aids may be significantly impacted by an incident. Additionally, accessibility services training will be improved for all frontline employees. While some improvements will take time, our members are committed to making progress and taking action to implement these commitments. Over the last decade, A4A members have and continue to actively engage in many collaborative efforts to improve air travel accessibility, in addition to their own internal efforts. In 2016, the airline industry, aviation stakeholders, the disability community, and the DOT agreed to regulations for accessible lavatories on single-aisle aircraft and improved accessibility of in-flight entertainment. We continue to stand by this agreement. The industry is already also hard at work on implementing the recommendations of the DOT's Air Carrier Access Act Advisory Committee, which DOT established at the direction of Congress. For example, in collaboration with the disability community, the industry is developing guidance and best practices for the handling and stowage of mobility aids to reduce the potential for damage. Also, A4A and Airports Council International North America are establishing a working group to develop guidelines and best practices for assisting passengers with disabilities with self-identification upon arrival at the airport. The aviation industry is also working with the Rehabilitation and Engineering Society of North America, RESNA, along with the disability community, to develop standards for mobility aids in air travel. Last year, RESNA issued design and testing standards for mobility devices that are better designed for air travel. A4A and our members are also working closely with disability community organizations on other initiatives, including improving the safe travel of service dogs and assistance during TSA security screening. Some air travel barriers require holistic and broader solutions beyond the aviation industry. For example, unfortunately, many mobility aids are solely designed for in-home use, not the rigors of air travel. We strongly encourage stakeholders, including lawmakers, the health insurance industry, and the mobility aid manufacturing community, to recognize that individuals who use mobility aids routinely travel by air, and that we need mobility aid designs that facilitate safe and seamless air travel, but never with additional cost to the user. In closing, the safety of our passengers, including passengers with disabilities, as well as our employees, is the top priority for U.S. Airlines. As reflected in our members' most recent commitment, we're dedicated to an inclusive experience for passengers with disabilities. We appreciate and look forward to continuing our collaboration with Congress and our partners testifying today to identify accessibility barriers and solutions. Along with our partners, we look forward to implementing holistic solutions that are realized collaboratively, safely, and efficiently, ensuring that air travel remains inclusive and available for all passengers. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Keithley. I very much appreciate that. Appreciate all the panelists. We'll now turn to questions. And we'll first recognize the chair of the full committee, Mr. DeFazio of Oregon, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair Larson, and thanks to all for your testimony today. First to Brian Ricks, you gave a number, I think $120 billion over the next 10 years projected for airport improvement and needs.
Chairman, that is correct.
And how much of that can we see funded?
How much of it will we see funded?
Yeah.
Probably a small portion of it.
Okay. So I guess that kind of raises the issue, which I'll be passing on to Garrett Graves, who I think will chair this committee in the future, of whether or not we should raise the passenger facility charge so we have a user fee which pays for the airport improvement as opposed to putting that burden on the general public. Would that be, do you think that would be necessary?
That is certainly something that airports have been in favor of for many years.
Okay, all right. Well, let's hope they can get it done. I'm passing the baton here, Garrett. On the issue of for Heather Cross, did you say that complaints were up 50%? Is that what you said?
Yeah, I was citing the DOT complaint numbers, and so from 2019 to 2021, they were up 54% disability-related complaints.
Okay. And we know a lot of times that, how accessible is the complaint process? I mean, years ago, I established a 1-800 number, and I think it went away. I don't know whether, and it was supposed to be posted everywhere.
Yeah, I mean, we have certainly looked at that and made recommendations to DOT where they've taken some actions to make the complaint process, make it more known that that's a process through which folks can register complaints. So they've done some more public outreach on that, improved their websites.
So you think it's fairly well known and accessible, but probably not optimally?
I think it's, you know, it's always good to continue to make folks aware of resources that are out there.
Okay, great. And then to Graham Keithley. I appreciate, you know, I mean, you've heard the testimony. We've got a ways to go. I mean, things are better, but we've got quite a ways to go. And I guess one of the key things is, you know, I think airline employees are getting training on how to handle these aids and people, but in many cases, the airlines are using contractors who have high rate of turnover or low pay, and I don't think that they're getting adequate training, or are they getting any training at all on passengers with disabilities? Do you have knowledge of that, of some of your member airlines?
Chairman DeFazio, thank you for the question. Airlines do actually have to take responsibility for the training of their contractors to help with passengers with disabilities. That is part of the DOT regulations. That is also part of our members' commitment to improve their training for all their frontline employees that do help passengers with disabilities. And part of that commitment is to facilitate improvements with their contractors that also help.
Okay. Ms. Ansley, what are you hearing about the contractors and others in terms of their capability of dealing efficiently with people with disabilities?
Thank you for the question, Chair DeFazio. Unfortunately, what we are hearing is that contractor employees are ill-equipped to assist people with catastrophic disabilities in terms of communication, not being able to follow the direction of the individual, not knowing how to use the aisle chair, which is the device you have to use to get on the aircraft, and also not understanding proper procedures, such as showing up with one individual to try to transfer somebody who is over 200 pounds from a wheelchair into a passenger seat.
Okay. Anybody else have a comment on the adequacy or inadequacy of the contract employees or others? Okay. Mr. Scott, congratulations on your numerous successes in competing. Do you have a comment on those issues when you've had problems? How responsive or who was responsible for the problem?
Thank you for the question. I feel that in processes like these, I feel that the people that are handling me with the Nile chair or handling my chair or other sport-related equipment or personal equipment just lack the training, or as you mentioned, can just be contracted that have nothing to do with the airline.
Okay. All right. My time's expired. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Now turn to Representative Graves of the great state of Louisiana for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate you recognizing the greatness of my state. Ms. Ansley, thank you for being here. We've had a number of folks that have spoken to us about technologies that have helped to improve the experience for those with disabilities, for many of your members, especially in the area of navigating airports. I'm just curious if you have examples of different technologies that have improved that experience, one, and two, you cited a number of safety and other concerns in your testimony. Are there other technologies that you've seen, I guess I'll use the term, partially deployed or are promising to address some of these remaining concerns that you have?
Thank you for the question, Ranking Member Graves. Unfortunately, technology is not very available to assist people with disabilities who use wheelchairs. It's still a very antiquated, hands-on process. There is a device that would help individuals transfer from their wheelchair into the aisle chair and then into the passenger seat that is designed like a lift you might find in a hospital that is mechanical. It needs an individual to operate it, but it is mechanical. That is available in some places, limited number of places, but for the most part, technology has not really improved. There's certainly been technological improvements for people in navigation, as you mentioned, for people who are blind, low vision. So there have been technological improvements, but wheelchair users, unfortunately, have not been the beneficiary of many of those.
Thank you. Mr. Scott, you made note of the, I guess, the sensitivity with the damage of equipment like wheelchairs. Could you describe the process that you go through to identify or alert folks about the damages that have occurred, or just reporting those concerns?
Yes, of course. So immediately when getting off of an aircraft, that's the first thing that we're meant to do is check to make sure that everything is in working condition. Once we realize that it has been broken, damaged, or destroyed, there's a long customer service process. Filling out the right forms, making sure that everything is documented. And I will add that a lot of the airlines are taking accountability when it comes to replacing these items. But as I mentioned in my testimony, when they've been mishandled and mistreated by people that are untrained, just simply replacing those items it's not enough.
What about the process of before you fly, the process you go through to actually alert the airport, or excuse me, the airline that you would need assistance traveling? Could you describe that process?
Absolutely. Even when buying my ticket, I indicate that I am traveling with a disability and have a manual wheelchair. They ask if you have a manual wheelchair or an electric wheelchair. I indicate that upon arrival. I go through the airport with both of my chairs, my everyday chair and my basketball chair. And when I get to the gate before we take off, they're given a gate check tag that claims the size, the condition, and the weight of the chair before it takes off. So it's tagged before we arrive. They know that they need to bring that to the gate when I arrive.
Thank you. And Mr. Keithley, in your testimony, you described a number of the actions that airlines have taken, and you're part of the commitment to improve accessibility. Can you elaborate on some of those actions and provide an update on the commitments that you all have made?
Yes, Ranking Member Graves, thank you for the question. We would characterize our commitments and our initiatives in three steps. We have industry, airline particular initiatives, we have industry-wide initiatives, and we have initiatives to improve the entire holistic environment, air travel environment. Airlines right now, and our members in particular, have taken on the renewed commitment to improve accessibility. It's a 4-part action commitment to include having the accessibility advisory groups to incorporate the disability community into our operations and procedures development. We have improvement in handling mobility aids. We have the improvement to our training, as well as our support for the study and development of new technologies to make aircraft more accessible. Along that initiative, we also have a number of industry-wide initiatives, including those led by our companion association, the International Air Transport Association, to improve coding of disability requests, to improve air mobility aid handling. And then we also have the efforts, which I mentioned earlier, regarding RESNA and the improvement of mobility aid handling. So it's a multi-part process to improve the accessibility experience.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, you're back.
Thank you. I'll recognize myself for 5 minutes. First question's for Mr. Scott. And if you could expand a little bit, Mr. Scott, on how air travel has changed for you from when you first started to now, and would you characterize that as improvement? And what would you characterize as the next 2 things that need to happen?
From when I first began traveling as an athlete, I will say that the process has improved. To say it's dramatically improved, definitely not. But there has been an improvement as far as accountability is concerned. It used to be a legitimate fight in order to help realize the damage that's been done, and get the airlines to be accountable for the replacement of this equipment. The next question you asked is what are the next things that needs to happen? As I mentioned before, the untrained personnel that are handling these equipment, I don't think they realize the sensitivity of handling these wheelchairs or handling these assistive devices with the proper training that maybe that could alleviate some of those challenges. Also, having a place to store this equipment and store these assistive devices on board, so the passengers actually have a hand in how that is handled and how that is stored. When I'm traveling internationally, a lot of times that the airplane is a little bit bigger, and I'm able to bring my chair on board because it's the chairs are made very suitable for travel. So I'm able to take my wheels off and put them in a closet that's usually meant for an airline hostess to put their bags in. But they have allowed me to use those things. So having something like that, a larger area to put assistive devices in, could be something that alleviates all of this.
Thank you. Ms. Ansley, Could you give me a perspective, give us a perspective on what, the wheelchair we think, we see it at a hospital or such costs versus the value of a wheelchair that one of your members might be using for their day-to-day living?
Thank you, Chairman Larson. So the average chair that someone might see at a hospital that's just at the entrance that someone can use is in no way compares to a highly customized wheelchair that most individuals with spinal cord injury or ALS or MS use in their daily lives. They are literally pieces of equipment that are very durable. They are designed to be used outside the home, and they can cost tens of thousands of dollars. It's often a fight for people to get the chair they need, even the one that their doctor has prescribed for them. Through the VA, our members are able to more easily get access to equipment, but the average individual, it can be quite a struggle. And in terms of what that chair, like I said, financially could be tens of thousands of dollars, but to the individual who relies on it, there is no price.
Thank you. Ms. Kraus, in your report, pages 11 through 13, you've listed sections, various sections of the 2018 law. Several of those sections are still in progress. Which of those how many of those are sort of in progress because it was a process recommendation versus the ones that there should be a hard deadline and things should be done, and then why aren't those things done?
Yeah, so the 10 provisions, 5 of them have been completed. So some of those related to studies that needed to be completed, as we've talked about the data related to reporting mishandled wheelchairs and scooters, as well as a service animal notice. The ones that remain, yes, some of those were related to getting recommendations from the advisory committee and others. I think the other thing that DOT officials have discussed with us is just that office has been, busy addressing the surge and complaints that they've had related to the pandemic and the refunds as well. So that's contributed to them working through and trying to prioritize efforts.
Yeah, okay, thank you. I've got a little time left. I will respect the other members and move on, and we'll now recognize Mr. Stauber of Minnesota for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair Larson, for holding this hearing. Very important. Brian Ricks, welcome. For those of you who don't know, Brian and I go back a ways when he was executive director of the Duluth International Airport. You left it in good hands, and Tom Warner's following up. He's doing a great job. And so I have the privilege of flying out of Duluth and Minneapolis quite a bit. Mr. Ricks, MSP is awesome. It is a great, great facility. I've flown around the country in many parts of the world, and MSP compares and does great work for the passengers. It's a pleasure to fly. I want you to keep up the good work. I know you will, and you're very well respected in this arena. One of the things that I just want to share with all of you is hearing Mr. Scott's testimony and others that have disabilities. I have a child who has Down syndrome, and the prognosis is severe and profound. So he has his walk is different, his gait is different. And I have to tell you that when we have flown with our Isaac, the getting from maybe one gate to the others and walking is very difficult. So when we need that assistance, wheelchair assistance or the electric carts, sometimes it's difficult. Once we get off the plane, if it's even delayed just a little bit, the apprehension that mom and dad have and other family members with us to try to make that connection. I would just say that we've had, I think, mixed results in getting to our gates with assistance of a wheelchair and or the electric cart when requested. So I think that we're all here today to try to improve on that. This is our goal, to improve, and I know that Chair Larson and I spoke about this last week. This is an extremely important component of safe and effective and really making air travel, the experience, even better. So I would just say this, that from my testimony, or my hearing the testimony of Mr. Scott today, I can't imagine getting off an airplane and having your mobility device damaged. I don't know, other than the way he described it, I can't imagine. And so to me, that seems like training that could be something simple to incorporate. So when they get off that plane, that they have their mobility device, they have that in working condition so they can enjoy wherever they are. Mr. Ricks, I just want to talk to you. Tell me about how MSP handles those with disabilities in the airport, and how do you make changes to accommodate such passengers and make it easier and friendly for the families? I've seen it. I just want you to reiterate more.
Thank you, Member Stauber. It's great to be here today as well, and with you, and see you again. We have a program called Navigating MSP, which is a program that was started over 10 years, actually close to 15 years ago. And that program is around, as I mentioned in my testimony, about bringing families and individuals that have concerns about flying into the airport and doing a run-through. We have a wonderful partnership with Delta Airlines in establishing that program and their support of that program. It actually brings people on board aircraft. I mentioned we have a mock aircraft training facility currently, and that does wonders. There's been thousands of individuals and families that have been through that program, and I can't tell you how appreciative they are of that investment of time and service, not only from our staff, but from airline staff, the CBP, the TSA, really to work through that. So there's a number of things that we have going. Some of the other things, I talked about IRA to help navigate individuals that have issues with vision through the facility. That is a great program. We pay for that as an airport. We're serious about that customer service element. We are piloting a talk-to-text program that actually will text gate announcements to individuals that are waiting for the aircraft. As far as the wheelchair issues and concerns that we've talked about this morning, we also entered into an agreement with a company to have wheelchair and scooter repair service right on the airport, so that if there are issues coming off an aircraft, they can contact them and get a spare issued while their wheelchair is being repaired. So we're very proud of the proactive nature. I think our focus is really on customer service, and I think that's the foundation of addressing these issues.
Thank you very much. My time's up, but keep up the great work. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Stauber. The chair now recognizes Representative Cohen of Tennessee for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I want to thank Chairman Larson and Representative Burchett for holding this important hearing today. I appreciate the subcommittee's interest in addressing challenges for passengers with disabilities and making air travel more accessible. One issue I've been working on extensively for many years is ensuring that minimum seat dimensions necessary for passenger safety, including seat pitch, width, and length, are available, especially how that affects airplane evacuations. In 2018, I was proud that the SEAT Act that I sponsored became part of the FAA reauthorization. That was in 2018, and finally required the FAA to evaluate this issue and establish minimum dimensions for airplane seats. Even though the FAA was congressionally mandated to act on this provision within 1 year, the FAA did not begin testing in Oklahoma until late November and December of 2019, well after the deadline. During its testing, the FAA limited its study to able-bodied individuals between the ages of 18 and 60, excluded individuals with disabilities, lap children, seniors, significantly overweight people, totally not part of the team. Even worse, the FAA did not disclose the results of their quote-unquote study until March of this year. This is 2022. 4 years, they were supposed to do it within a year. The FAA concluded the seat size and spacing did not adversely affect the success of emergency evacuations. Ms. Krause, in your testimony, you stated that for passengers with disabilities, embarking and disembarking the aircraft can be a lengthy process and require assistance from personnel. In your opinion, how can a study that neglected to account for factors like disabilities, specifically wheelchair use or people with braces, orthotics, not be used to inform policies on cabin evacuations and minimum seat size?
Our understanding is FAA is in the process of now it had put out a notice to gather comments to get some insights on passengers with disabilities and thoughts on the safety in terms of seat size. And so they have that comment period recently closed, and they're going through over 20, I think it's close to 26,000 comments and reviews.
Right, I know that, but this is 4 years after they were supposed to report to us, and they included nobody with a disability in their study, in their evacuations that were supposed to, which they deemed showed that everything was fine and they didn't need to change anything.
There are some, when it comes to live testing, there are some ethical type issues to think about when it comes to the type of folks to involve in that. As I understand, is they did some live testing for FAA's study.
Yeah, but they had no people with disabilities, and they claimed they thought there could be liability. I don't see liability issues. I don't really see it. I'm a trial lawyer. I didn't see the liability issues, but it was an errant for them to say that their study showed something. They should have said their study was faulty because it didn't consider all of the different type of people that are in fact on airplanes. Mr. Keithley, you're on a Zoom with us, I believe. Is that right?
Yes, Congressman.
Thank you, Mr. Keithley. During the FAA's public comment period, there was an outpouring of concern about shrinking seat size and passenger space in the 26,000 comments. In your testimony, you mentioned the airlines, quote, continue to support the study and development of more accessibility features on aircraft that will broaden air travel opportunities for passengers with disabilities, unquote. Thank you for that. But you also said, while some improvements will take time, your members are committed to making progress and taking action to implement these commitments. Thank you again. At the same time, however, the average width of an airline seat has shrunk from 18 inches to 16 and a half inches. Do you think the airline industry practices like shrinking seat sizes and row spacing are compatible with your words ensuring that passengers with disabilities are treated with dignity and respect?
Congressman, thank you for the question. Safety is our priority in all of aviation. Safety isn't necessarily my area of expertise. We're happy to provide a copy of our comments to the FAA's most recent request for information. We look to the FAA to determine what is safe for aircraft and what can be safe for aircraft evaluations.
But you have an opinion, don't you? You think people with disabilities should have a safe experience when they're on that airplane. Is that right?
Mr. Congressman, absolutely. We always agree that the safety of passengers with disabilities, like all of our passengers and employees, is a top concern.
Let me say this. I've got limited time. I wear a brace. Sometimes with that brace, I get up and it's more difficult to get out of that seat. And especially as small as it gets, if you're in the back, you can't maneuver quickly. And if you don't have people with orthotics and people with canes and people with wheelchairs, you're not going to have an adequate study, or you're not going to be prepared to help people with disabilities get off in case of an evacuation. Your organization did make some comments on FAA seat size dimensions. The comment that further, it says minimum dimensions, passenger seats are not warranted, you said. The comment argued that further rules regarding minimum dimensions, including pitch, width, length of seats, are not warranted, while acknowledging the FAA's most recent emergency evacuation did not fully account for a number of human factors, including passengers with disabilities. We've heard, how can you really be interested in people if you've already said that the FAA study was fine? There's been testimony today about challenges of air traffic travel for people with disabilities and the devastating consequences of uncommon but severe accidents and mishaps on their lives. In light of this testimony, would you agree it is, quoting AFA's comment, not worth the exposure and futile to account for their experiences?
Congressman, we look to the FAA to determine safety for seat sizes.
Steve, don't go anywhere. Thank you. We now recognize Mr. Burchett of Tennessee for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to yield 2 minutes to my friend, former Senator Cohen, when I knew him back in the state legislature, Congressman Cohen, to continue this questioning, because I, in fact, was on the seat with a huge gentleman beside me, and we were both squished in there, and it was really uncool. And besides, he called my mama when my dad died, so I'm going to yield 2 minutes to Congressman Cohen.
Thank you, Mr. Burchett. I appreciate it. I would like to ask, the first thing, when we started, Mr. Keithley, when you said, I asked you the question, and you said, thank you for the question, that's started me to thinking your answers aren't going to be really direct and honest because you didn't really want to thank me for that question. That's a question you'd rather not have asked of you. So I picked up on your drift. Passing it off the FAA, that's not. I want to know what you think, what the airlines think. To say that you trust the FAA, the MAX went down twice, and you trusted the FAA. Now, why do you trust the FAA when they have people dying and when MAXs fall out of the sky?
Congressman, as I mentioned earlier, safety is beyond my area of expertise. We're happy to continue working with your office to address minimum safety size for aircraft seats, but I can't speak to that.
Well, Mr. Schuster was good in helping get this in the bill, and we thought we'd have an answer by now. 4 years later, I submit to you, we'll get the answers to who killed Kennedy before you give us a true answer on seat size and width from the FAA.
That goes to me, Mr. Chairman, I believe. You're welcome, Mr. Cohen, as always, and thank you. And my mama would thank you if she were alive today. Mr. Matt Scott, have the airlines offered you any compensation? And if so, what would that have been? Sir?
No, unless you think of replacement of a chair as compensation. I've never been offered any compensation.
Yeah, but you're out. I mean, you're out. You said it's an extension of your body. You are out.
That's right.
Well, that's disgusting to me.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Thank you for your testimony. Ms. Krause, has the Department of Transportation worked to address the lacking disability training for airline customer service personnel? I know that when I fly on American, and the people are very nice, and they're trained, and they seem a lot of expertise in there, but there seems to be different, you have different flight attendants, you have different activity, and I'm wondering, is there some equal training that everybody gets and is required to get on this type of thing?
So in terms of training, there is some basic requirements in terms of what airlines need to cover. When we looked into it, a lot of the airlines, when it comes to training, they do train their own employees on those requirements, but the contracting, so there's a lot of the services, especially the wheelchair service, is contracted out. And so those, we found when we talked to the airlines, much of that training is being carried out by the contractors, training their own employees. We have somewhat limited access to that training. We are able to see some of the topics that are covered. There can be some, they cover generally the same topics. They can vary in length. They can vary in the time that they cover. But we had found, based on the information they provided, that they do revisit the training and try.
But there is no specific training that is mandated by DOT or anyone like that.
Just the broader areas to cover. Broader
areas. Explain that to me real quick.
Yeah. So like there's
in a non-Washingtonian way. Okay.
Sure, absolutely. So airlines are required to train their employees on the ACAA regulations and requirements, as well as procedures related to carrying those out.
Okay. Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I'll yield the remainder of time. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. Chair recognizes Mr. Carson of Indiana. There he is. Mr. Carson, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Such heartwarming testimony. I do have a question. This spring, the DOT opened a new rulemaking to improve laboratory restroom accessibility on single-aisle aircraft, but I'm concerned that the proposed new requirements wouldn't go into effect for 18 years. In our last authorization bill in 2018, my safety provisions for secondary cockpits were mandated to go into effect within 1 year of being enacted. Unfortunately, industry opposed these safety improvements, complaining about cost. I'd like to get to your thoughts about this proposal. Waiting 18 years for accessible restrooms for passengers who need them now, is that the best we can do? What do you recommend?
Ms. Carson, can you clarify who that's for?
Yes, this is in relationship to the DOT rulemaking to improve laboratory accessibility on single-aisle aircraft. The new proposal would not go into effect until about 18 years. So it doesn't seem tenable for me. It seems too long to have such a grave inconvenience occur, quite frankly. So what can be done to address this issue? And this has come from constituents. This is kind of the source of this. And, you know, I'd like to get thoughts. I mean, you know, waiting 18 years seems like a very long time for passengers who need them right now. It's certainly not the best we can do. So I'd love to get insights.
Any of the witnesses, feel free to answer.
Thank you for the question.
This is for everyone on the panel, yeah.
So access to lavatories is something that Paralyzed Veterans of America has been working on literally for decades, and single-aisle aircraft. We did participate in the negotiated rulemaking in 2016 that led to the agreement of 18 years. We agreed, as I said in my testimony, because we needed a date certain that this would happen. We had literally been discussing this for so long that if we had agreed to something outlandishly, again, 30 years ago, we'd be there. That being said, in our comments to the DOT, that agreement was made in 2016, and the focus was that then airlines would have time to prepare for this change because of the potential loss of seats. We can say that since then, you know, nothing has happened. In fact, PVA had to sue DOT to move the rule forward, and we believe that the proposal that should come out from DOT is at least 12 years at the very least, and that's in line with our agreement, and we do stand by our agreement. I will say that I've had the opportunity in recent months to actually go in an accessible lavatory with some of our members that meets the requirements of the law or what the rule would be. It's almost to the point of being able to be fully certified, and it wouldn't require a loss of seats. And we hope that airlines would move, would not wait for the rule, but would move as expeditiously as possible because this is an injustice and inequality.
That's so true. If I could follow up, Mr. Vanna, you noted that under the prior administration, the DOT has said that requiring accessible lavatories on single-aisle aircraft could lead to a loss of revenue. What is your response to that now? Is that still a prevailing thought?
Congressman, the agreement from the 2016 negotiated rulemaking took into consideration many factors, including the manufacturing cycle, the design cycle. As far as I understand it, and which was the comments submitted by the manufacturers to the Department of Transportation, there actually is no currently fully accessible lavatory that meets DOT's proposed standards. They will still have to go through the design, manufacture, and acquisition process. We look forward to working closely with our manufacturing partners and with the DOT and the disability community to bring that rulemaking into fruition and implementing it.
Thank you. I yield back, Chairman.
Thank you, Representative Carson. And I recognize Representative Steele of California for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Larson, Ranking Member Graves, and the witnesses. Orange County is the nation's 4th largest with the highest veteran population. Veterans have made immense sacrifices on behalf of all of us. And one of my top priorities in Congress is to ensure that our veterans can receive high quality accommodations and timely services. As mentioned by our witnesses, many disabled veterans travel frequently, especially around this time of the year during holidays to see families and friends. The TSA screening process is an important part of the traveling. However, it can also pose many challenges for our disabled veterans, particularly for those with prosthetics wheelchairs, and other mobility aids. So, Mrs. Ansley, if the Vets Safe Travel Act passes the House of Representatives and becomes law, how will this improve the experience for our disabled veterans, and how will this impact the airport security experience, not just for disabled veterans, but for all travelers?
Thank you for the question, Representative Steele. The Vet Safe Travel legislation would make the TSA PreCheck program available free of charge to any veterans who meet all the requirements of the program and who use prosthetic devices, wheelchairs, so that they can access the PreCheck experience. For a person who permanently uses a wheelchair as part of their daily life, if they have PreCheck, they're able to have their hands or wheelchair feet swabbed to see if there's explosives, and if there aren't, they're good to go. That's the end of their screening. If they have to go through the standard screening process, then that requires a full pat-down, which takes a long time, requires hands-on movement of individuals, and it can be very invasive and very lengthy. And we would like to provide ways to make sure that our veterans are able to avoid those pat-downs, and we also call on TSA to implement technologies that would allow wheelchair users to not automatically be flagged for these types of screenings.
Thank you so much. And Mr. Kitley, with inflation skyrocketing, increased fuel prices, and rising general cost, the price of airline tickets are difficult to many to purchase, especially around the holidays. With this in mind, how many of your members offer veterans discounts on airline tickets?
Congresswoman, thank you for the question. Unfortunately, I don't have the information on our members' discounts. I'm not an expert in our members' fare structures, but I'm happy to work with our members and get information over to your office.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. The chair recognizes Congresswoman Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you to all of our witnesses who are here today. There are 42 million Americans who have a disability. It's enough of a challenge to travel hundreds of miles. We shouldn't have anyone living with the fear of their mobility aids being lost, damaged, or mishandled when traveling, as we've heard from our witnesses today. Air travel should not only be accessible, but also a safe and dignified experience. Ms. Ansley's testimony cited GAO's 2020 report on the accessibility of U.S. aircraft lavatories, specifically that accessible lavatories are available, but that carriers don't often choose to acquire them. Mr. Keithley, could you elaborate on why carriers are often hesitant to acquire accessible lavatories?
Congresswoman, thank you for the question. And referring back to my answer a little bit earlier, none of those lavatories actually meet the DOT standards which DOT has proposed. We're looking forward to the DOT finalizing its rules, which are supposed to come out next April, so that the manufacturers can start meeting those obligations and airlines can start installing them.
Thank you. So I just want to make sure that I'm hearing that. So even the current ones are not sufficient.
Congresswoman, yes, from our understanding of the comments from the manufacturers, the current solutions do not meet DOT's proposed requirements.
Thank you. And Mr. Reichs, my district is home to Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport. And I know you've all heard me say it is the world's busiest and most efficient airport. But if it is not efficient enough to make sure that it's accessible for all passengers, then I've got work to do. So given your expertise and familiarity with the large hubs, what can Congress do to help large airports become more accessible?
Thank you, Representative Williams, for the question. I believe, as I said in my testimony, it comes down to funding, first and foremost. There are a lot of needs out there, and I mentioned this, the shortfall is significant. And so Congress could go a long way in really supporting additional funding for the airport terminal program and the AIP program in general. And I think a recognition of the priority of accessible airports for all certainly would help in that regard to prioritize those investments.
In your testimony, you mentioned that next year's FAA reauthorization is an opportunity to narrow the gap and make our airports and terminals more accessible. Can you elaborate more on what those policies might look like?
Well, again, I think certainly recognizing, I think the ATP program went a long way to recognize that airport terminal projects should be prioritized and that there was a backlog there. So I think, again, given that much of these investments are in facilities for airports, that prioritizing those investments, maybe looking at eligibility requirements for those investments at airports would be a good start.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you very much. Chair now recognizes Congressman Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing, and thank you to the witnesses for your time and for your testimony. Airline employees and contractors are responsible for properly handling cargo, which for passengers with disabilities includes mobility aids such as wheelchairs. However, too often we see that this equipment is being handled with, or is not being handled with, appropriate care as required under federal law. For example, earlier this year, we saw many Paralympians arriving at Atlanta's Hartsfield-Jackson Airport to compete in the July 4th annual AJC Peachtree Road Race. Numerous passengers reported damages to their wheelchairs, and for some, their chairs never arrived, forcing them to bow out of the competition completely. As one racer, Julia Beckley from Colorado stated, quote, "Things get broken and that sucks, but when you lose your when you lose someone's day chair and race chair, you're taking away their entire life in a second," end quote. Unfortunately, this is because airline employees aren't sufficiently trained about how mobility aids, particularly wheelchairs, should be handled. Ms. Ansley, can you speak to the gaps in training among airline workers on the storage and handling of specialty mobility aids that impacts passengers with disabilities and proves financially burdensome?
Yes, thank you for the question, Representative Johnson. Certainly, we do know that there are many gaps in not only training, but also in the infrastructure surrounding wheelchair stowage. So we often know that information that is provided by passengers about their wheelchair may not be fully conveyed through their travel process so that everyone knows they are traveling with a wheelchair, including upon their arrival. We also know that there's often gaps in the resources that are available to get the wheelchair into the cargo area. And it's important to note that depending on the aircraft, it can actually be very difficult or even impossible practically to get a wheelchair into the hole, to store it into the cargo area because aircraft are not designed to accommodate wheelchairs. It is an afterthought of accommodation that only came, quite frankly, because of the passage of the Air Carrier Access Act, that we have to accommodate passengers with disabilities. And it's still evident in the structure that you see in the airport system. There are also difficulties in being able, at times, particularly with power wheelchairs, to get them from the jetway where the individual transfers from the chair down to the ramp because of placement of elevators within the airport and the infrastructure to get it down to the ramp. And then, of course, there are concerns with turn time, wanting to get the plane reloaded as quickly as possible to get it on its way. Also means at times cutting quarters, people looking outside the window to see staff lifting 400 or 500-pound wheelchairs, physically lifting them. It is truly dangerous, not only for the individual who has their legs, if you will, being moved in and out of a cargo area, but also the individuals that are left to do this work. And that is why we support people being able to remain in their wheelchairs, on the airplane, just like they do on trains and buses and subways and other forms of mass travel in this country.
Thank you. Ms. Kraus, according to your testimony, we've seen DOT implement several accessibility-related provisions to the FAA Reauthorization Act of 2018. For instance, DOT issued a notice to the largest U.S. airlines establishing a compliance date for reporting requirements on the number of wheelchairs and scooters that were implaned and the number of these items that were mishandled. However, DOT is still working on rulemaking for other requirements under the 2018 law. What would you say are the limitations that have prevented full implementation of these and other necessary provisions?
So some of the, as they've been working through things, some of this has been contingent on studies being completed and advisory committee looking into some of these issues and making recommendations. They also, the DOT office is also, it is fairly small and has had a lot of efforts being directed towards dealing with the refund issues out of the pandemic. But yeah, as you note, they are moving forward on a couple of rulemaking processes now.
Thank you.
What's been the problem with it having not
Congressman,
been
I
done
think
earlier?
the 5 minutes is up. Maybe they can answer that question in writing. Thank you so much.
Interesting question.
Thank you.
I'll now recognize myself for up to 5 minutes. I want to thank Chairman Larson for holding this important hearing that is especially important for so many Americans, and I want to thank each of our witnesses for their testimony, especially our colleague, Representative Langevin and Mr. Scott, for sharing their very personal experiences, and a point of personal privilege to thank Representative Langevin for doing such a great job representing his community and all Americans in Congress, an impactful member of our Congress. They are not alone. The experiences they described are like so many of the other individuals with disabilities traveling by air, and unfortunately, they are all too common. Last month marked the 36th anniversary of the Air Carrier Access Act, which prohibits discrimination against persons with disabilities in commercial air transportation. Through the act and the landmark Americans with Disabilities Act, we have made significant progress toward ensuring equal access for those with disabilities. But barriers to air travel, inaccessible lavatories, injuries when boarding or deplaning, inconsistent security screenings, and damage to mobility aids, they still persist. These barriers often force individuals with disabilities to endure additional challenges when traveling. They'll dehydrate and fast to avoid having to use a lavatory. Their mobility devices often become inoperable because of damage caused by an airline's handling or storage. For too many, the high stress and anxiety that comes with these situations forces them to simply avoid air travel altogether. This is unacceptable, and we simply must do better. Mr. Keithley, I have a question for you. I want to touch on Representative Langevin's highlighted issues on lithium-ion batteries, which are becoming more common in power chairs. How frequently are passengers denied boarding because their power chair has a lithium-ion battery?
Congressman, thank you for the question. I don't have that precise data, but I'm happy to go back to our members and get some data information for you. We continue to support the FAA's and the Pipeline and Hazardous Material Administration's determinations on lithium-ion batteries, and safety is our primary consideration for carrying those batteries.
What steps are the airlines taking to better educate ground crew, gate personnel, other contractors on the FAA standards for these batteries to prevent situations like the ones Representative Langevin experienced?
Congressman, as I mentioned earlier, our members are engaging in improvements in their training, as well as the training of their contractors. We look forward to incorporating a better knowledge of handling of mobility aids and look forward to making improvements in that area.
A question for Ms. Kraus. How do U.S. airlines' current policies on lithium-ion batteries compare to current FAA safety standards?
Unfortunately, that's not an issue we've looked at, but I'm happy to work with your staff to see if we can get an answer.
I very much appreciate it. All right, with that, I'll yield back. And our final member for questioning now is Congresswoman Titus.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And I too want to thank Mr. Langevin for being such a champion for these issues. And I was pleased to join him on introducing the Air Carrier Access Amendments Act. And I hope that we can make that a priority. We don't have much time before the end of the year, but it's certainly obviously from this hearing, very important. I'd like to ask Ms. Ansley the first question. You know, I represent Las Vegas. It's one of the world's top destinations, and we pride ourselves on having very good access for those with disabilities. We got 40 million visitors a year coming from all around the world. And we know that the travel experience and your holiday, when you talk about it and you reflect on it, begins the minute you leave the house. So that includes getting on the plane, your experience in the airport, how the plane does to accommodate you. And I wonder if you would address what are some of the things that we can put in the FAA reauthorization that address some of the questions that have come up today and just make the travel experience better for people with disabilities. Now is the time. We were going to do this reauthorization. We ought to take advantage of the opportunity to see what we might be able to include.
Thank you, Congresswoman Titus, for that question. And PBA held its 75th annual convention at Las Vegas back in 2021. So we were
thank you for that.
Pleased to be in your state. We really believe that there is much that can be done in the 23 authorization similarly to what we had in 2018. That including provisions of the Air Carrier Access Amendments Act in the reauthorization. It is truly the only way that we are going to address the structural problems with how aircraft are designed and with processes. I don't believe that you can train your way out of these issues. Training is a component, it certainly is, but the system is simply not designed to accommodate people who use wheelchairs in air travel the way that we have it today. And we also support increased enforcement. We've heard a lot about those complaints that are filed with DOT. Many people don't even file the complaints anymore because they feel like they do and nothing changes. Even when they get a letter saying that the complaint was valid, they don't see any changes. They don't receive any compensation. They don't even receive an I'm sorry from DOT. If you file with the airline, if you're an incident, typically you may be offered miles to travel on the airline again. They are supposed to fix your wheelchair if they damage it and it's been disassembled. And there's a lot of, and so we think that people being able to remain in their wheelchair, in addition to enforcement, continuing the work that was done in 2018 in terms of the study on in-cabin wheelchair restraint systems is another good way for us to move forward. And again, really take this opportunity to make a change, move beyond best practices and individual action. 40 years of activity in this area has shown us that unless Congress and DOT act, we don't see changes in the system.
FAA is one of the most hidebound agencies that I know. It's very hard to get them to change, and often they hide behind it's all about safety. Well, we certainly want it to be all about safety, but we don't want safety to just become an umbrella excuse for not doing anything. My second question was going to be just what you mentioned to Mr. Keithley. When it comes to disability-related complaints, would you walk us through that process? How do you address them? How do you review complaints? Do you have any people from the disability rights community engaged in that process?
Certainly, Congresswoman. When an airline receives a complaint, there's a multi-step process. If the complaint occurs at the airport, and this is all regulated by the Department of Transportation under a rigorous regulatory regime. If the complaint occurs at the airport, the airline is required to provide what's called a complaint resolution officer. And those resolution officers are supposed to be available 24/7. And they're supposed to have the authority to dispose of the concern, as well as have special knowledge about the ACAA regulations. If the complaint comes in after the travel experience, the department also has regulations to require that we respond to the passenger's complaint to address their potential violation and also inform them that they can take their complaint to the Department of Transportation. We take all of that, we take that complaint data, we aggregate it, we code it, and we provide it to the Department of Transportation to help them identify trends and also help us to identify trends. Our members are, some of them already have, and others are creating advisory boards for the disability community, so that they can help analyze those trends, those complaints, and make improvements where they see those trends.
Thank you so much. Time is ended.
Thank you.
Thank you, Congresswoman. Next up will be Congressman Mast.
Thank you. Appreciate it. So, Mr. Keithley, I wanted to start with you and just bring up a conversation about walking assisting devices. I walk with a cane on a daily basis. Some people have crutches. There are variations of walking sticks that people use. And I'd be curious to know your opinion on it, recognizing where you come from the airlines. When I get on a plane on a weekly basis, I use my cane to walk onto that aircraft down the ramp, which is sometimes pretty inconvenient because of how steep they are, and the fact that for the bulk of those ramps, there are not handrails on the way down. There's just usually two short sets of handrails down where those things accordion, if you want to use that word for it. But then I get onto the aircraft and the flight attendants will say, hey, we need to put your cane up into the bin, to which I've had numerous conversations about this. And they said, well, we assure you that if you need your cane, we'll get you your cane back, of which I think is absolutely not likely at all, that if there's an emergency situation in the aircraft, nobody is coming back to get my cane out of the upper bin. And so I'm just wondering your opinion on why that needs to be in place or doesn't need to be in place for passengers to move those mobility aids to the bin. And I'll give you one other statement. It was said to me, well, if you were to pass out, also, then your cane would be in the way. Well, I have two prosthetic legs, and beyond that, I weigh about 170 pounds. So on top of a cane being in the way, there would be two prosthetic legs and 170 pounds of dead weight. So I don't think that's a great reason either, but I'd be curious to know your opinion on it.
Certainly, Congressman, thank you for the question. The rules for requiring the stowage of mobility aids were developed with, first, obviously, safety is the first consideration in mind. If there are additional concerns about safety and evacuation, we certainly defer to FAA as our safety regulator, as DOT with the expertise in accessibility and safety to make improvements to that regulation to ensure that your evacuation is safe, you have the mobility device that you need, and that the entire flight is safe for all passengers.
So I just asked, this is something that we revisit and look at. Do you think we could find agreement? It's unlikely a flight attendant is going to come back and get my cane if there's an emergency situation on the aircraft.
Congressman, I think the flight attendants are dedicated to assisting you with your disability and your service needs. I think this is actually a great opportunity for something that the ACAA Advisory Committee could take a look at, which is going to be reconstituted by DOT. And this was that was the committee that was created by Congress.
Good. Well, I appreciate it. I'll look forward to looking at that with you all. I want to bring up a slightly different issue in the 2 minutes that I have remaining. And this is just something that I think is related to assistance for individuals with disabilities, but a host of others as well. And I'm just going to share a personal story on this. I was flying from Grand Rapids, Michigan to Florida. I had picked up my father, or rather my father was flying back to Florida with me. And he's 92 years old. He doesn't have a printer in his house. His phone doesn't have texts enabled on his phone. And so the ability to actually get him his ticket was something that was limited by his age and his use of technology. But as we were flying with Frontier Airlines, we did witness that there is a $25 per passenger per direction charge to utilize anybody's assistance at the ticket counter. And it actually, I printed off the regulation on it. It says $25 per passenger per direction for customers who have not prepaid this charge for any assistance from the airport agents. $25 for any assistance. Now, while I was on that flight, and this is something that I would like to help to find an answer to, I was sitting in the second row and I listened to the two flight attendants on the flight argue for about 45 minutes that the ticketing, or rather the ticket counter agents were receiving a commission off of that $25 charge, and that Betty or Gail or whoever it was, the name is that they were talking about working there, had cleared $4,000 in the last month off of charging those $25 charges for every time somebody needs to use the ticket counter. Now, if we were talking, I don't know if that's true, number one, I want to get facts on this, but number two, if we were talking about payday lenders outside of military bases or credit cards or something, everybody would be blowing a gasket. And I think this is something that also relates to individuals with disabilities and their access to technology. So I hope that we can have help finding an answer on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Congressman Mast. I believe that is all the members asking questions. So that concludes our hearing. I'd like to thank our witnesses for their testimony. The comments and insights have been very informative and helpful. I ask unanimous consent that the record of today's hearing remain open until such time as our witnesses have provided answers to any questions that may be submitted to them in writing. I also ask unanimous consent that the record remain open for 15 days for any additional comments and information submitted by members or the witnesses to be included in the record of today's hearing. Without objection, so ordered. The subcommittee stands adjourned.